A man walks into his own home on a Thursday afternoon, carrying nothing more than a carton of ice cream. He is thinking about his kids. He is thinking about the look on their faces when they walk through the door later that evening from church and see the flavors he picked out just for them. He is thinking about being a good father. He is thinking about the kind of small, beautiful moment that makes all the hard work worth it. He sets the ice cream down on the kitchen counter. And in that instant, in the home he built with his own hands, in the sanctuary he believed was the safest place in the world, his life is taken from him. 2 shots. To the back. No warning. No chance to turn around. No final words. No goodbye. Just ice cream melting on a granite countertop while he bleeds out on the floor beneath it. And the woman who made sure he walked into that trap was across town. Sitting in a church. Holding her children's hands. Counting down the minutes. This is not a story about a stranger. This is not a story about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is a story about a man who was loved into a cage, deceived by the person he trusted with everything, and then coldly eliminated when he got too close to the truth. This is the story of Mark Despain. And this is Cold Case Solved. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. If you believe that victims like Mark deserve to have their stories told, if you believe that the truth should never stay buried, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. This community exists because people like you refuse to let cases like this disappear into silence. Every single subscriber matters. Every share matters. So do it now, because what you're about to hear is something you will not forget. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mark Evan Despain was born in 1977 in Jonesboro, Arkansas. For anyone who has never been to northeastern Arkansas, Jonesboro is the kind of American town that used to feel like it existed outside the reach of the worst things in the world. A city of roughly 70,000 people. Neighbors who wave from front porches. High school football games that pull entire communities together on Friday nights. A place where people leave their doors unlocked because they genuinely believe they are safe. That sense of safety, that trust in the people around you, is exactly what makes what happened to Mark Despain so devastating. Mark grew up in that world and he fit it perfectly. He was active, outgoing, and deeply embedded in his community. He played football at Nettleton High School, and if you ask anyone who knew him back then, they will tell you the same thing. He was not the flashiest player on the field. He was not the guy making highlight reel catches or drawing the attention of college scouts. But he was the guy who showed up to every single practice, rain or shine, whether he felt like it or not, whether it mattered to anyone else or not. He was the guy who gave absolutely everything he had on every single play. He was the guy his teammates could count on, no matter what, no matter the circumstances, no matter the score. And that quiet, consistent, unshakable reliability, that refusal to cut corners or coast or do anything less than his full effort, was not just who Mark was on the football field. It was the blueprint for his entire life. It was the code he lived by in every room he ever walked into, every relationship he ever formed, every responsibility he ever took on. You could count on Mark Despain. That was simply who he was. He graduated from Nettleton High School with the class of 1995. 18 years old, standing on the edge of adulthood, full of the kinds of dreams and ambitions and quiet determination that every young person carries into the world when they believe anything is still possible and the future is entirely open. But life had different plans for Mark Despain. Because during those high school years, Mark met a young woman named Michelle Kelly. She was a year younger than him, still navigating her own teenage years, and she was already carrying responsibilities that most teenagers never face. Michelle had a daughter from a previous relationship. A little girl named Brooke. Being a single teenage mother in a small southern town in the mid-1990s carried enormous social weight. It was not easy. It did not come without judgment. Sometime in 1995 or early 1996, Michelle became pregnant with Mark's child. And when both families found out, there was no discussion. There were no alternatives explored. There was only one acceptable path in that time, in that place, in that culture. Both sets of parents delivered the same message with zero ambiguity. You got her pregnant. You marry her. Period. End of discussion. And so in 1996, Mark Despain, 19 years old, married Michelle Kelly, who was 18. They were children themselves, pressed into adult lives before either of them had fully figured out who they were as individuals. This was not a marriage born from two people choosing each other freely after careful consideration and deep emotional connection. This was a shotgun wedding in the most literal sense of that phrase. A marriage created by external pressure, family obligation, and social expectation. Now I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to this story. I am not saying that marriages like this cannot work. I am not saying that two young people forced into a difficult situation cannot build something genuine and lasting. Many do. But I am saying that when a relationship begins under that kind of pressure, when it is rooted in obligation rather than free choice, it sometimes carries cracks in its foundation that do not show up right away. Cracks that can take years, even decades, to fully reveal themselves. And when they do reveal themselves, the damage can be catastrophic. But here is what you need to understand about Mark Despain, because this is the part of the story that tells you everything about who he was as a human being. Despite the circumstances of that marriage. Despite being thrust into adult responsibilities before he was remotely ready. Despite being a 19-year-old kid with his whole life suddenly redirected. Mark did not just marry Michelle because he had to. He did not just acknowledge the baby that was coming. He made a choice. A deliberate, unconditional, wholehearted choice. He embraced Michelle's daughter Brooke as his own child. Completely. Without reservation. Without distinction. He never treated Brooke as anything other than his daughter. He loved her the same way he would love his biological children. He provided for her, showed up for her, and raised her as if she had been his from the very first day. That tells you who Mark Despain was. Over the years, Mark and Michelle had two sons together. Zach and Blake. The Despain household grew into a full, noisy, chaotic, joyful family. 3 children. A blended family. And Mark threw himself into fatherhood with the same relentless dedication he had shown on the football field. He was present. He was involved. He was the kind of father who showed up. And alongside that, Mark was building something remarkable. He learned the real estate business from the ground up, working alongside his parents, Jack and Tana Despain. He started at the absolute bottom. There was no inheritance waiting for him. No trust fund to soften the edges of failure. No wealthy relatives ready to bail him out if things went wrong. Everything Mark Despain ever achieved, every single dollar he earned, every property he acquired, every piece of the life he built, came from his own hard work and his own determination. He learned property appraisal. He learned property management. He learned how to identify investments, how to evaluate value, how to run a business with discipline. He absorbed everything his parents could teach him and he applied it. Eventually, Mark founded his own company. A property appraisal and investment business that he operated right out of his home at 4320 Jenny Lane in Jonesboro. This was not just a job for Mark. This was his dream made real through sheer effort. He built something from nothing. He created value where none had existed before. He established himself as a respected businessman in his community. The office at Jenny Lane became the headquarters for a growing operation managing multiple properties, conducting professional appraisals, and generating the kind of income that moved the Despain family solidly into upper-middle-class prosperity. Michelle, meanwhile, had taken a job at a local bank, developed real skills in financial services and money management, and eventually transitioned into managing the books for Mark's business. She became the person responsible for tracking income, managing expenses, paying bills, and maintaining the financial records that any serious operation requires. On the surface, it looked like a perfect division of labor. Mark focused on generating revenue through appraisals and property investments. Michelle kept the finances organized and the money flowing smoothly. A partnership. A team. A husband and wife working together to build their family's future. From the outside, the Despains looked like the American dream in its purest form. A beautiful home in a safe, quiet neighborhood. 3 healthy children. A thriving family business. Regular attendance at Central Baptist Church. They were the family that other families looked at and envied. They seemed to have it all figured out. But behind that carefully maintained image, behind the Sunday morning smiles and the Christmas card photos and the portrait of prosperity, there were cracks forming. Deep, dangerous cracks. Cracks that no one outside the family could see. And those cracks started with a man named Carl Kelly. Carl Kelly was Michelle's father. He came from working-class origins and had spent his life doing manual labor. Honest work, but the kind of work that pays the bills without ever quite getting you ahead. Carl had not had the education, the opportunities, or the lucky breaks that might have lifted him into a different economic position. He had accepted his lot, or so it seemed, until he watched his daughter marry into a situation that offered something he had never had access to. Real money. Real property. A lifestyle he had only ever observed from the outside. When Carl watched Mark and Michelle's business grow, when he witnessed the income and the properties and the expanding prosperity, something shifted in how he saw things. Why, he must have asked himself, should he continue taking orders from strangers when his own son-in-law was running a business that needed help? Why work for people who had no connection to him when he could work for family? Mark, who was generous by nature and always willing to support the people in his life, brought Carl into the business. Carl started managing rental properties. He collected rent from tenants. He handled maintenance issues. He dealt with the everyday problems that come with running a property portfolio. Over time, Carl became more integrated into the business. He gained more responsibility. More access to financial information. More influence within the family structure. But alongside all of that, Carl gained something else. Resentment. Because the reality of the situation was this. Mark treated Carl exactly as what Carl was, which was an employee. Mark, as the business owner, assigned tasks and expected them to be completed properly. Mark maintained professional standards and held Carl accountable for his work the same way he held everyone accountable. Mark made the final decisions about properties, about investments, about the direction of the business. And Carl, despite being the father-in-law, despite being the elder of the 2 men, had to take orders from a man who was younger than him. A man who, in Carl's private estimation, was nothing more than the kid who had gotten his teenage daughter pregnant and been forced to marry her. This dynamic ate away at Carl Kelly in a way that never stopped and never softened. The traditional family hierarchy he believed in, the one where the father figure is the patriarch who commands respect and deference from the younger generation, had been completely inverted in his world. Carl found himself subordinate to his son-in-law. He had to answer for his work. He had to accept direction on how tasks should be done. He had to accept criticism when things were not completed correctly or professionally. He had to defer to the judgment of a man who, in Carl's private internal narrative, had no business being in a position of authority over him at all. For a man of Carl's generation, a man raised with very traditional ideas about masculine authority and the natural order of family structure, this was not just inconvenient. It was corrosive. Every single day he showed up to work for Mark Despain was a daily reminder of what Carl perceived as a humiliation he had not earned and did not deserve. And that perception, whether it was fair or not, whether it reflected any kind of objective reality or not, compounded over years into something that bore very little resemblance to its original form. It had become something darker. Something that was looking for an outlet. That resentment did not fade with time. It did not lessen as the years passed. It festered. It deepened. It evolved. And over years and years of accumulated daily indignities, real or imagined, it transformed from wounded pride and bruised ego into something that had shed all the softening emotions and become something cold and purposeful and far more dangerous than wounded pride ever is on its own. But Carl Kelly was only the first crack. The second fracture was even more destructive, and it would ultimately lead to Mark's complete isolation from everyone who might have protected him. Mark had always worked closely with his parents. Jack and Tana Despain had taught him his profession. They had supported his decision to start his own company. They were proud of what he had built and they remained actively involved in his life and his work. But as it so often happens when family relationships and business relationships become entangled, disputes began to emerge. There were disagreements about money. About the direction of investments. About control and authority over decisions. Michelle, in particular, had heated confrontations with Jack, Mark's father. The exact nature of those disputes is not entirely clear, but the tension escalated steadily over time. And then Michelle did something that would change everything. She dropped a bomb into the middle of the family that could never, under any circumstances, be undone. Michelle accused Jack Despain, Mark's own father, of having inappropriate photographs of Brooke on his cell phone. I need you to stop and really sit with what that accusation means. This was not a minor family disagreement. This was not a misunderstanding over money or business decisions that could eventually be smoothed over. This was an accusation so serious, so morally devastating, that it could not be taken back regardless of whether it was true or false. Once those words were spoken, every relationship they touched was changed permanently. Mark faced an impossible choice. On one side was his father. The man who had raised him. The man who had taught him everything he knew about his profession. The man who had been in his corner for his entire life. On the other side was his wife. The mother of his children. His partner in building everything he had. There was no way to stand in the middle. A choice had to be made. Mark chose Michelle. He stood by his wife. He went further than that. He went so far as to file a formal report with law enforcement against his own father based on Michelle's accusation. Investigators took it seriously, because they had to. They examined Jack Despain's phone. They reviewed every single photograph on that device. And what they found was this. The photographs in question were selfies. Selfies that Brooke herself had taken while she was using her grandfather's phone. There was nothing inappropriate about them. There was no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. No charges were ever filed against Jack Despain because there was no crime. The accusation was completely and entirely unfounded. But the truth, as true as it was, could not undo the damage. Even after investigators cleared Jack Despain completely, even after it became obvious to anyone paying attention that the accusation had no merit, the relationships had already been destroyed. The trust had been shattered beyond recovery. Mark, having publicly stood against his own father, having filed an official report, having made his choice visible to everyone in the family and the wider community, cut off all contact with Jack Despain. He stopped speaking to his father entirely. He refused to see him. He severed that relationship as completely as if the man had never existed. Tana, Mark's mother, was absolutely devastated. Her family was being torn apart and she was powerless to stop it. The pain was so intense that she temporarily separated from Jack, unable to navigate the impossible position she had been placed in. The Despain family, once close and united, was shattered. Now here is where I want you to pay very close attention, because this is where investigators who later reviewed the full timeline began to see something deeply disturbing. When they looked at this sequence of events, not as an isolated incident but as a piece of a larger pattern, they began to suspect that this accusation may not have been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. They began to suspect it may have been a deliberate, calculated strategic move. Not a genuine concern expressed clumsily. A weapon. Aimed with precision at one specific target. With one specific purpose. The complete isolation of Mark Despain from his support network. Think about it. If you wanted total control over another person, what is the first thing you would do? You would cut them off from the people who love them most. The people who know them best. The people who would notice if something was wrong. The people who might ask difficult questions or challenge behavior that did not add up. You would isolate that person. You would make them dependent on you alone. You would remove every alternative source of guidance, support, or outside perspective. The accusation against Jack Despain, whether it was a conscious strategy from the beginning or an opportunistic exploitation of a family conflict, achieved exactly that result. It destroyed Mark's relationship with his parents. It eliminated the one independent perspective in his life that might have seen through what was happening. It severed the connections to the two people who knew him most deeply, who loved him most unconditionally, and who would have noticed if things were going wrong in his marriage or his business. It left Mark completely dependent on Michelle and Carl Kelly. The exact two people who were, unbeknownst to him, already laying the groundwork for his death. Isolation is a classic manipulation tactic. Cut the victim off from family and friends who might intervene. Create a situation where you are their only source of emotional support, their only trusted confidant, their only advisor. Once that isolation is complete, once all the bridges have been burned and all the alternative relationships have been destroyed, you have total control. The victim has no one to turn to. No one who might notice the warning signs. No one positioned to help them escape. Mark Despain, who had once been surrounded by people who loved him and would have done anything for him, now found himself completely alone. Except for Michelle and Carl Kelly. The two people who were, at that very moment, deciding that he needed to be removed. While Mark worked every single day to support his family, while he conducted appraisals and managed properties and handled all the demands that running a business requires, Michelle was living in a completely different reality. A reality hidden behind password-protected accounts, carefully maintained lies, and a performance of normalcy that she had been rehearsing for years. The public image the Despains projected to their community, to their church, to their neighbors and friends, was one of prosperity and stability. The beautiful home. The nice cars. The comfortable lifestyle. The children in good schools. Everything about their external presentation said this is a thriving, successful family. Behind the scenes, hidden entirely from Mark's awareness, the financial reality was catastrophic. The business that Mark believed was generating healthy profits and growing steadily was actually drowning. Not in manageable, temporary debt. In massive, crushing, overwhelming debt. Over $2 million worth of financial obligations that were spiraling completely out of control. Unpaid bills stacked in piles. Collection notices arriving with increasing frequency and increasingly threatening language. Properties on the edge of foreclosure because the mortgages had not been paid in months. Creditors calling at all hours demanding payment. The entire financial structure that Mark believed was solid and secure was a house of cards teetering on the absolute edge of total collapse. And who had been managing those books? Who had been responsible for tracking the money, paying the bills, and maintaining the financial health of the business? Michelle Despain. The woman Mark trusted more than any other person on earth. The woman who had complete access to every account, every transaction, every financial record. Mark had given her that access freely and completely, because why would he not? This was his wife. His partner. The mother of his children. The person who had been by his side since they were both teenagers. When Michelle told him the business was doing well, he believed her. When she told him the bills were paid and everything was under control, he had no reason to doubt it. He trusted her the way you trust the person you have shared your life with for 15 years. But Michelle had been systematically and deliberately deceiving Mark for an extended period of time. She had been diverting funds. She had been making unauthorized transactions that benefited herself at the expense of the business. She had been covering her tracks with false records, fabricated documentation, and outright lies. And she had become remarkably skilled at it. Skilled enough to maintain that deception for years while everything crumbled around the edges of the life they had supposedly built together. Skilled enough to look her husband in the eye every morning over breakfast and tell him everything was fine. Skilled enough to sit beside him in church on Sunday mornings and present the portrait of a faithful, stable, committed wife while the business he had poured his life into was being quietly hollowed out from underneath him. The question that haunts this case, the question that investigators and journalists and anyone who has followed it closely keeps returning to, is why? Why would she do this? What was she spending the money on? Where did over $2 million go? Some of it went to maintaining a lifestyle that exceeded what the business could actually support. Some went to personal purchases and expenses that Michelle kept entirely hidden from Mark. Some of it simply vanished into a maze of transactions that were never fully explained or accounted for. But the total picture that emerged was one of a woman who had been treating the family business as her personal account while telling her husband that everything was fine. While he worked himself to exhaustion generating the income she was quietly siphoning away. Eventually, as it always does, the deception began to crack. Mark started noticing inconsistencies. Bills he thought had been paid turning out to be months overdue. Account balances that did not match what Michelle had told him. Creditors contacting him directly instead of going through her. Small details that did not add up. Questions forming that Michelle could not easily answer. And according to statements that investigators later obtained, Mark had recently told several people in his life that he was considering divorce. He had discovered the financial irregularities. He had begun to understand the scope of what Michelle had been doing. He had started to see through the facade she had so carefully maintained for years. And he was contemplating ending the marriage. For Michelle, that was an existential crisis. If Mark filed for divorce, the legal discovery process would expose everything. He would gain access to the real financial records. He would see the full extent of what she had done. He would understand exactly how much money she had diverted, how many lies she had told, how completely and systematically she had betrayed him. He would almost certainly pursue criminal charges. She would face prosecution for fraud and embezzlement. She would lose her home, her lifestyle, her children, her freedom. Everything she had built, every comfortable corner of the life she was living, would be gone. But there was another angle. Mark had substantial life insurance policies. Michelle was the beneficiary. If Mark were to die unexpectedly, those policies would pay out. The debt problems would potentially be resolved or at least managed. Michelle would maintain control of everything without the complications of divorce proceedings, criminal charges, or the public exposure of her financial crimes. The calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Mark alive and asking questions represented certain disaster for Michelle. Mark dead represented salvation. And so Michelle made her choice. Mark had to go. She knew exactly who to turn to. Her father, Carl Kelly. When Michelle approached Carl with what she was thinking, Carl did not hesitate. He did not try to talk her out of it. He did not suggest that there had to be another way. He did not remind her that they were discussing the cold-blooded murder of her husband, the father of her children, a man who had never done anything but work himself to exhaustion every single day to provide for the people he loved. Carl Kelly had his own years of accumulated bitterness ready and waiting. Years of taking orders from a man he resented. Years of festering anger over what he perceived as disrespect. Years of feeling humiliated by the inversion of the authority structure he believed he deserved. When Michelle raised the idea, Carl was immediately on board. He would help organize it. He would make it happen. But neither Michelle nor Carl could carry out the act themselves. They needed someone else. Someone willing to pull the trigger in exchange for money. Carl reached out to a man named Johnny Heward. Someone he knew through his various personal and business connections. Someone who operated on the margins of polite society with connections to people willing to do things that law-abiding citizens would not consider. When Carl explained what he needed, Howard agreed to help. He knew someone. A man named Terrence Barker. Terrence Barker had a criminal history. He lived at the edges of the law, doing whatever he had to do to survive and make money. He was not a professional in any sophisticated sense. He was not connected to organized crime. He was simply a desperate person who was willing to do terrible things for cash. When Howard approached him with the proposition, when he laid out what Carl and Michelle wanted and what they were prepared to pay, Barker agreed. The price they agreed on is one of the most disturbing details of this entire case. Because the price they placed on Mark Despain's life was just a few $1,000s. Not hundreds of thousands. Not millions. A few thousand. That is what his wife, his father-in-law, and the men they recruited decided was a fair exchange for ending the life of a husband, a father, a son, a businessman who had spent his entire adult life working to provide for his family. The plan they put together was simple, and in some ways the simplicity of it makes it more chilling. Complexity at least suggests careful thought. Simplicity reveals a casual, almost offhand disregard for human life. Michelle would establish her alibi by taking the children to church activities that afternoon. She would be visible, surrounded by witnesses, fully accounted for during the window when the murder would take place. Carl would make sure he was seen elsewhere, creating his own distance from the scene. Barker would enter the house, stage it to look like a burglary gone wrong, a random home invasion, and wait for Mark to come home. When Mark walked through the door, Barker would be ready. The date was set. August the 24th, 2011. A Thursday afternoon in late summer. Everything was arranged. Everyone knew their role. All that remained was for Mark Despain to walk into his own kitchen. On that Thursday morning, Mark and Michelle sat down together and had lunch. They talked about ordinary things. Mundane household matters. The kids' schedules. Michelle mentioned the church activities she was taking the children to that afternoon. Mark said he would pick up some ice cream on his way home as a treat for when they got back later that evening. It was a thoughtful, ordinary, tender gesture. The kind of small act of love that parents perform without thinking twice. Mark chose those flavors carefully. He thought about which ones each of his children would love. He was thinking about their smiles. Michelle sat across the table from him and counted down the hours until he would be gone. She left with the children. Mark finished his afternoon, ran his errands, stopped at the store, selected the ice cream, paid for it, and drove home to 4320 Jenny Lane. He pulled into his driveway. He gathered up the carton. He walked to his front door, keys in hand. He unlocked it. He pushed it open. He stepped inside. Terrence Barker was waiting in the kitchen, exactly as planned. Mark walked into the room. He set the ice cream down on the granite counter. Maybe he heard something in that moment. Maybe a footstep. Maybe a shift in the air. Maybe he started to turn toward the sound. We will never know. We will never know what thoughts moved through his mind in those final seconds. Whether he had even a moment to understand what was happening to him. Whether he felt fear or confusion or the dawning recognition of something impossible. Whether in those last fractions of a second, his mind went to his children or his parents or the life he had built from nothing and was trying so hard to protect. We will never have those answers. What we know is that Terrence Barker fired 2 shots into Mark Despain's back. Mark collapsed to the floor of his own kitchen. The ice cream he had bought for his children sat on the counter above him. And it began to melt in the warm August air. Mark Despain was 44 years old. A father of 3. A man who had built everything he had from absolute nothing. A man who had loved unconditionally and worked relentlessly. A man whose last act on this earth was buying ice cream for his kids. Barker left through the back of the house, leaving behind the staged burglary scene they had planned. Drawers pulled open. Items scattered across surfaces. The visual markers of a break-in designed to send investigators in the wrong direction entirely. Later that afternoon, Michelle returned home with the children. She approached the house. She opened the door. She stepped inside. She discovered her husband's body on the kitchen floor. She activated the home alarm system, creating a time-stamped record of her arrival. Then she called 911. And she began performing the role she had been preparing for. The shocked, devastated, grief-stricken widow who had just stumbled upon the most horrific scene imaginable. But here is the thing about genuine grief versus performed grief. Experienced law enforcement officers know the difference. They have seen both, many times over. They know what real shock looks like. They know how people actually respond when they discover the body of someone they love. They know what authentic devastation looks like in a human being's face, voice, and body. And they also know what a performance looks like. From the very first moment that responding officers arrived at 4320 Jenny Lane, from their very first interaction with Michelle Despain, multiple trained professionals independently noted that something was wrong. Something about her behavior did not feel genuine. Something about her reactions did not match what they knew grief and shock actually look like in real people. The house appeared to have been ransacked. Drawers open. Items scattered. All the visual markers of a burglary gone violently wrong. But investigators noticed almost immediately that the staging did not hold up. The jewelry that any real burglar would have grabbed was exactly where it had been. Electronics that represent easy cash for a thief were completely untouched. Visible cash had not been taken. The drawers had been opened, yes, but the actual valuable contents had not been removed. It looked like someone's conception of what a burglary scene should look like based on watching television crime dramas. Not like an actual theft committed by someone trying to steal property quickly. And Michelle's behavior at the scene raised even deeper concerns. Her crying seemed exaggerated. Performed for the audience of first responders rather than flowing from real devastation. Her emotional responses were wildly inconsistent. She would be completely calm and almost businesslike while answering questions, then suddenly break into dramatic sobbing, then just as quickly return to composed. None of it had the quality of authentic emotional response that officers had observed countless times in their careers. She seemed more focused on managing her presentation, on controlling how she appeared to others, than on the fact that her husband was lying dead just feet away from where she was standing. She asked procedural questions that seemed bizarre and oddly rational for someone in the middle of discovering their spouse's body. She appeared to be thinking several steps ahead rather than being trapped in the overwhelming present moment the way a genuinely shocked person would be. Detective Vic Brooks of the Jonesboro Police Department took the lead on the investigation. Brooks was an experienced investigator with the kind of instincts that only come from years of working serious cases and studying people under the most extreme kinds of stress. He had seen real grief many times. He had seen real shock. He had been present in the aftermath of genuine, unexpected violence, and he knew precisely what those scenes look and feel like. And from his very first interaction with Michelle Despain, from his first careful assessment of that crime scene, from the very first minutes he spent in that kitchen and on that front lawn, his gut told him clearly and unambiguously. This was not a random burglary. This was a targeted killing. Someone who knew this house, who knew this family, who knew Mark Despain's schedule and habits, had organized this. The scene was staged by someone who had watched too many crime dramas and not enough real cases. And the most likely architect of that staging was the woman standing right in front of him, cycling through emotions with the mechanical consistency of someone following a script rather than actually living through a nightmare. But instinct is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. A detective's gut feeling, no matter how experienced and reliable that detective is, cannot send anyone to prison. Detective Brooks needed to connect the dots in a way that would stand up in a courtroom beyond any reasonable doubt. And so he began the patient, methodical, painstaking work of building a case from the ground up. What happened outside the house while investigators processed the scene was almost as revealing as what had happened inside it. As yellow police tape went up and uniformed officers kept the gathering crowd back, the two patriarchs of the extended family came face to face on the front lawn. Carl Kelly and Jack Despain. The man who had helped orchestrate the murder and the man who had been falsely accused years earlier to destroy his son's trust in him. They confronted each other in full view of investigators, officers, neighbors, and news cameras that had already arrived on scene. Carl immediately began shouting accusations at Jack, blaming him for Mark's death, suggesting that Jack was responsible, creating a scene of loud, dramatic intensity that pulled every eye in the vicinity toward it. I want you to think carefully about what Carl Kelly's behavior in that moment tells us. His son-in-law had just been found shot dead in his own home. His daughter had just discovered the body. This should have been a moment of horror and grief and coming together. Instead, Carl Kelly immediately launched an aggressive, public campaign to point the finger at someone else before investigators had even properly started their work. That is not what an innocent person does. That is not how a shocked, grieving man behaves. That is the behavior of a guilty person who knows investigators will be looking for suspects and is desperately trying to put a different name in their minds before the process begins. That is someone who already knows exactly what happened and is working to control the narrative from minute one. Detective Brooks observed all of it and filed it away. In the early days of the investigation, Carl pushed hard on the narrative that Jack Despain was responsible. Jack had motive, Carl argued loudly. He had been cut off from his son. He had been accused of terrible things. He had reason to be angry and resentful. Obviously, Carl insisted, Jack had done this. For his part, Jack Despain did not create scenes or hurl accusations. He simply told investigators, quietly but clearly, to look very carefully at Carl Kelly and Michelle Despain. The first real breakthrough came not from forensic evidence, but from the streets. Terrence Barker could not keep his mouth shut. He started talking about what he had done. Bragging about it to people in his social circle, almost certainly trying to seem dangerous and significant. Law enforcement calls this street talk. It is one of the most common ways that criminals undo themselves. The inability to keep quiet about something they know they should never speak of. Word of Barker's bragging made its way back to Detective Brooks through informants and community sources. Brooks began focusing on Barker. Who was he? What possible connection could he have to the Despain family? How would he have known to target Mark Despain specifically? Around the same time, witnesses came forward reporting that they had seen a beat-up blue Mercedes parked in the neighborhood around the time of the shooting. They remembered it because it did not belong there. It stood out in that quiet residential area. Investigators traced that vehicle to Johnny Heward. Another name. Another connection. Another link in the chain. But the most devastating evidence, the evidence that would unravel the entire conspiracy completely and permanently, came from technology that the conspirators had dramatically underestimated. Cell phone records. And text message recovery. Investigators obtained warrants for the phone records of both Michelle Despain and Carl Kelly. They pulled the call logs. They pulled the text message histories. And they discovered that both Michelle and Carl had deleted large numbers of messages on the day of the incident or shortly after. They had clearly understood, on some level, that their phones contained evidence. They had tried to eliminate it. Here is what they did not understand. Deleted does not mean gone. When you delete a text message from your phone, you remove it from the visible interface. But the underlying data often still exists, either on the device itself in recoverable form or within the carrier's own systems. Forensic analysts working with the cell phone carriers were able to recover a significant number of those deleted messages. What those messages revealed was catastrophic to any possible claim of innocence. The messages showed coordination between Michelle and Carl. They showed planning discussions. They showed deliberate communication about timing and logistics. And then investigators found it. The single most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. A recovered text message sent by Michelle Despain on August 24, 2011. 4 words. It has to be today. Let that sit for a moment. That message did not come from a woman going about her normal life, unaware of anything unusual about to happen. That message came from someone coordinating a planned event with specific timing requirements. That is not something you write if you are innocent. That is consciousness of guilt, captured and preserved in digital form. It has to be today destroyed any remaining possibility that Michelle and Carl were grieving bystanders rather than the architects of everything that had happened. The conspiracy chain was now crystal clear to investigators. Michelle Despain was the mastermind, the person who made the original decision and set everything in motion. Carl Kelly was the organizer, the person who used his connections to find the people willing to carry out what Michelle needed done. Johnny Heward was the connector, the middleman who linked Carl with Terrence Barker. And Terrence Barker was the trigger man, the person who had actually walked into that kitchen and ended Mark Despain's life in exchange for a few $1,000s. One by one, as investigators built their case and prosecutors moved forward, the conspirators fell. Terrence Barker, facing the weight of the evidence against him, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His sentence was 35 years in prison. Carl Kelly also pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He also received 35 years. He would never complete that sentence. Carl Kelly died in prison from congestive heart failure, ending his days behind bars, never experiencing freedom again. Johnny Heward pleaded guilty to hindering apprehension and faced additional consequences from prior probation violations. And then there was Michelle Despain. Prosecutors initially pursued the most serious charges available under the law. This was, after all, a cold, calculated, premeditated murder of an innocent man by his own wife, in conspiracy with her father and hired killers. But as happens in complex conspiracy cases, complications emerged. Evidentiary challenges arose. Some evidence raised questions about admissibility. The reliance on testimony from other participants in the conspiracy introduced variables that juries sometimes weigh skeptically. Prosecutors had to make strategic calculations about what they could prove to the standard required beyond a reasonable doubt. In 2013, after long consultations with Mark's parents, Jack and Tana Despain, prosecutors announced they would accept a plea agreement rather than pursue the maximum penalty. In 2014, Michelle Despain entered a guilty plea to 3 counts of hindering apprehension and prosecution. The most serious charges against her were dropped as part of the arrangement. Her sentence was 30 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving just 5 years. Let me say that again. Because it deserves to be heard clearly. Michelle Despain, who sat across the lunch table from her husband on the very morning she had arranged for him to be killed, who sent the message that said it has to be today, who recruited her own father to find a hired killer, who took her children to church as her alibi while their father was being shot dead in their kitchen, was eligible for parole after 5 years. According to available reports, Michelle was paroled in September of 2019. 5 years. For planning and orchestrating the execution of her husband. 5 years for the systematic betrayal of a man who had loved her since they were teenagers. 5 years for destroying 3 children's lives by taking their father from them, using their own grandfather to help do it. Today, Michelle Despain has disappeared from public view. No known social media presence. No interviews given. She has apparently chosen to vanish into anonymity, living whatever life she has constructed for herself in the years since her release. Whether she carries remorse for what she did, whether she thinks about Mark and the life she took from him, whether she considers the impact on the children she left behind in so many ways, we simply do not know. She has chosen silence. The life insurance money that had been part of Michelle's motivation, the payout she had calculated into her plan for the aftermath, became the subject of civil litigation. Insurance companies, for obvious reasons, do not pay out policies when the beneficiary is responsible for causing the death. Michelle invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and declined to testify in those civil proceedings. The full disposition of those claims remains unclear. Mark Despain left behind 3 children who were forced to confront a reality that no child should ever have to face. Zach, Blake, and Brooke lost their father in the most traumatic way that any child can lose a parent. And they did not just lose him to random violence or to some terrible accident that no one could have prevented. They lost him to the deliberate, calculated, premeditated choice of their own mother and their own grandfather. The 2 adults in their lives who were supposed to protect them above all things, who were supposed to be safe and constant and trustworthy, who were supposed to love their father the way parents and grandparents are meant to love the people their children love, conspired together to have him killed. How do you process that as a child? How do you hold that truth in your hands without it burning everything? How do you make sense of something that fundamental and that devastating? How do you trust anyone ever again when the people who were supposed to be the safest turned out to be the most dangerous? How do you build an adult life on a foundation that has been shattered from the inside by the very people who were supposed to hold it together? These are questions that Zach, Blake, and Brooke carry into every single day of their lives. Questions that will likely never be fully answered, no matter how much time passes or how much healing they work toward. The cruelty of what was done to those children, the secondary cruelty of it, the violence done to them that left no visible marks, may be the most quietly devastating dimension of this entire story. Jack and Tana Despain lost their son after years of estrangement built on a lie. They never got the chance to repair the relationship. They never got to sit down with Mark and tell him what had really happened, that the accusation against his father had been fabricated, that the crisis that had torn their family apart had been manufactured deliberately to separate him from the people who loved him most. They never got to tell him that they loved him and that they forgave him for the terrible position he had been manipulated into through no fault of his own. They never got closure. They attended their son's funeral knowing that the false accusation that had severed their connection to him had been a weapon aimed with precision. Knowing that if they had remained in his life, if those bridges had not been burned by design, they would have been watching. They would have asked questions. They would have seen the warning signs. They might have been able to reach him in time. That knowledge, the knowledge that their presence in his life might have been the thing that saved him, is a weight that no parent should ever have to carry. The case received significant national media attention. Dateline featured it in an episode titled The Root of All Evil, a title that captured precisely what drove this tragedy. The producers interviewed family members, law enforcement officials, and people from the community who had known the Despains. The episode painted a portrait of a family that appeared perfect from the outside while rotting from the inside, poisoned by greed, deception, and a capacity for betrayal that most people would find impossible to comprehend. Oxygen's Snapped program also covered the case in depth, examining Michelle's psychology and the process by which someone moves from wife and mother to the architect of her husband's murder. Detective Vic Brooks received the recognition he deserved for the work he did on this case. His refusal, from the very first minutes on scene, to accept the staged burglary at face value. His persistence in following every thread, no matter where it led. His comprehensive, methodical construction of a case against every member of the conspiracy. That is what genuine detective work looks like. That is the combination of instinct and discipline and absolute refusal to stop that brings justice to people who deserve it. And now, if you are still watching, I need to ask you something. Drop a comment right now that says I am still here. Let's see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is the part that stays with you. The part that answers the question everyone always asks in a case like this. How does this happen to a man like Mark Despain? How does someone become this vulnerable without ever knowing it? Because as I sit with everything I have researched about this case, as I trace every thread from beginning to end, what haunts me most is not the act itself. What haunts me is the architecture of it. The deliberate, patient, methodical construction of a trap that took years to build and that Mark walked into one piece at a time without ever knowing it was there. Mark Despain was not the victim of random violence. He was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was systematically and intentionally stripped of every protection he should have had, one relationship at a time, one lie at a time, one manipulation at a time, until he was standing completely alone with no one left to notice what was closing in around him. Think about what was taken from him step by step. His relationship with his parents, the people who knew him best and loved him most unconditionally, was destroyed by a false accusation specifically designed to sever that bond. The accusation was not random and it was not clumsy. It was aimed with precision at the one relationship that posed the greatest threat to Michelle's control. Jack and Tana Despain were the people most likely to notice that something was wrong in Mark's marriage. They were the people most likely to ask questions. They were the people most likely to see through a deception that a loving spouse can maintain indefinitely because the deceived party is too trusting and too close to it. Once they were gone from his life, that independent perspective, that outside set of eyes that might have caught what was happening, was gone with them. Then Mark's complete trust in Michelle, the trust he had placed in her because that is what you do when you love someone and have built your life with them for 15 years, was turned into a weapon against him. She had total access to everything because he gave it to her freely. She used that access to drain the business he had built from nothing while feeding him a false picture of financial health. His own faith in her became the instrument of his destruction. And then when he finally began to see the truth, when the inconsistencies became too obvious to ignore and the questions started forming that she could not answer, when he began to understand that the life he thought he was living was built on a foundation of lies, that awareness itself became the final sentence on his life. Because the moment Michelle realized that Mark was close to uncovering the full scope of what she had done, she understood that her only remaining option was to make sure he never lived to act on what he knew. Every single protection Mark should have had was stripped away by the very people who were supposed to be protecting him. Every relationship that might have saved his life was deliberately dismantled. He was maneuvered, step by careful step, into a position of complete isolation and complete vulnerability. And then he was eliminated when he became inconvenient. And then there is the cruelest irony in the whole story. From the very beginning, from the day he and Michelle were forced to marry as teenagers, Mark had embraced Brooke, Michelle's daughter, as his own child without hesitation and without condition. He never once treated her as less than his biological children. He loved her as a father loves a daughter. He provided for her. He showed up for her. He gave her every opportunity he gave Zach and Blake. And Michelle used an accusation involving that same girl, the daughter Mark had embraced completely and unconditionally, to destroy his relationship with his parents. To cut him off from the people who might have recognized the danger he was in and been able to reach him. The person he had chosen to love when he had no obligation to love her became the vehicle for his isolation from the people most likely to save him. Mark Despain's last act on this earth was buying ice cream for his children. He was thinking about seeing their faces light up. He was thinking about the simple pleasure of giving them something good at the end of an ordinary day. He was thinking about being a good father. That is who he was in his last conscious moments on this planet. A man thinking about how to bring a small moment of joy into his children's lives. He set that ice cream down on the kitchen counter and he never had the chance to give it to them. His children came home to find their father gone and their lives changed in ways they will spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of. His parents never got to make things right with their son. His community lost a man who had contributed everything he had to build something real and good in the world. And the woman who planned and coordinated every step of his murder walked out of prison after 5 years. Some wounds cannot be fully healed. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some injustices leave marks that no sentence, no matter how appropriate, can completely erase. This is one of those cases where the justice system did the work it could do and still left a gap that can never quite be filled. Mark Despain was not harmed by a stranger. He was not the victim of random chance or bad timing. He was deliberately, methodically, cold-bloodedly eliminated by the people he trusted most in the world. He deserved better. He deserved to grow old. He deserved to watch his children become adults, to meet his grandchildren, to sit on his own front porch in Jonesboro someday and look back on a life that had been long and full and good. He deserved to have the financial betrayal exposed through legal means, to have justice served through the courts rather than through violence, to have had the chance to rebuild. He deserved all of the ordinary, unspectacular, irreplaceable things that a decent human life is made of, and he was robbed of every single one of them by the person who had promised to stand by him. His children deserved better. His parents deserved better. His community, which lost one of its own in the most senseless and preventable way imaginable, deserved better. And his story deserves to be told in full, honestly, and without flinching, so that the truth of what happened to him cannot be softened or forgotten or allowed to fade. So that is what we do here at Cold Case Solved. We tell the stories. We speak the names. We trace every detail and follow every thread until the full truth is visible. We refuse to let the people who were taken from us disappear into silence because the people who took them would very much prefer that they did. We believe that every victim deserves a voice, even long after they are gone. Especially long after they are gone. Because the most powerful thing we can do for the people who can no longer speak for themselves is to make sure that the world keeps listening. Mark Evan Despain. 1977 to 2011. A football player who showed up for every practice and gave everything he had on every play. A father who loved every one of his children without condition, biological or not, from the very first day. A businessman who built everything he had from absolutely nothing through years of disciplined, relentless, unglamorous hard work. A man who walked into his own kitchen carrying ice cream on a Thursday afternoon in late August and never got to hand it to his kids. He will not be forgotten. Not here. Not ever. Before you go, here is what I need from you right now. If this story moved you, if you believe that Mark Despain and every victim like him deserves to be remembered, subscribe to Cold Case Solved right now. Turn on every notification. Share this video with one person who needs to hear it. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about the sentence Michelle received. Tell me whether you believe justice was truly served. Tell me what you think should have happened. I read every comment. This channel exists because people like you refuse to look away from stories like this. Mark Despain bought ice cream for his kids and never made it back to give it to them. The very least we can do is make sure his story lives. Until next time, stay safe. Stay aware. And remember, sometimes the greatest danger is not waiting for you in the dark. Sometimes it is sitting across the dinner table from you, wearing a familiar face, hiding the unimaginable behind a smile. This has been Cold Case Solved.